So let me begin this last of the lectures, as I always do, by thanking the shul over here, Shomer Muna, for being nice. They sponsored the whole, yeah. Oh, somebody took them down. Okay, great. Sponsoring the whole series, hosting the whole series. It's not a little thing. And be honest with you, at the beginning of this series, we're still in the middle of Corona. You know, it was a question about whether or not they would do so, but they were kind enough to do so. Nobody has to come. There are plenty of people, as you can see, that are not coming this semester. Once again, there are plenty of people, including Howard Elbaum, who does all the PowerPoints, who don't feel comfortable coming still because of the Corona. I totally understand. I respect that. Hopefully, by the time we get to the next season, this will be behind us, but maybe not. You know, here we have epidemiologists. He can speak to it better than I can. But we hope. One thing we're all on the same page is we certainly hope that this will be past us. I do want to thank the Lehman family, as we always do, for being the series sponsors. Tonight, give a round of applause. Year after year, they do it, and it's very nice, and it enables us, among others, to do this. I don't want to toot my own horn, but I don't think they do this in any other town, right? I don't believe we have this anywhere else in America or elsewhere. Number three, I want to thank tonight's sponsors, as you can see, which are the Pollocks. Raise your hand so people know who you are. Okay, she's too shy, Okay, and who are from Baltimore and Columbus, Ohio. Can you imagine that? Baltimore, Columbus, Ohio. You know, there are two towns that are adjacent to each other, right? Right? And they're in honor of a mutual friend, Rabbi Henoch Morris, who's a close friend of mine. He used to be in there. He's from now. He's the head of the Kollel in Columbia, where they do yeoman work. Columbia is not Baltimore, Maryland. It's a different series over there, and they put in a lot of time. And really, it's a very hard-working kollel, I guess in the best sense of the word, which is with the community. You understand? Maybe one day I'll get there, I'll see it in action, but I know that you don't go there to goof off. Let's put it that way. So, last but not least, I want to thank, especially tonight, you should give a round of applause to our tech team, which every year, and this year they're unusually efficient. As you notice, we're really starting pretty much on time. We've, Baruch Hashem, put behind us, I hope, all the glitches happened in the past, which are nobody's fault, but it can happen. And I guess without any further ado, we'll get down to work. As you know, tonight, the name of the series is The Last Years Before Oslo, the State of Israel and the Jewish People, 1988 to 1992. Tonight is 16 out of 16 lectures, number 16. Every year, I always put the same title for the last one, which is how the events of then affect us today. But obviously, the events of the last week have pushed that off the charts, and so it's going to be how the events of 1992 bear upon the current war between Russia and Ukraine, because that has certainly knocked us off. I would say that has moved to the top of the food chain, okay? And therefore, what I hope to do is, as I always try to do, is give some kind of historical background and bring in that where it is today, hopefully to shed a little more light than heat. So let's get down to business. How do the events of the late 80s and early 90s affect us today? Well, that's not too hard to answer. As you wouldn't have known, you would have known the picture of Putin, but 2 weeks ago you didn't know the picture of Zelensky. No. That's brand new. Okay? And of course, you can imagine how Putin, let's go to the next one, views the Ukraine. It's a military business. But to be perfectly honest, Putin has his point of view. The Russian nationalists have their point of view, which is to them. Now, this is always the problem. We're Americans, obviously, and things like that, so we look at it from our side of the Atlantic. But they don't live on our side of the Atlantic. We look at it from our side of Europe. They don't live on our side of Europe. And Russia does have a history of being invaded all the time, although they're not tzaddikim. They've invaded everybody else whenever they can. So this is, I'm just saying, let me put it this way. U.S. and Canada is inconceivable to the Russians. You get it? It's a big empty country and you never took it over? No, they don't get it. You follow? They don't get it. It's a different mentality. I'm not going to spend an hour, which I could, going into the history of, where the Russians come from and the Mongolian invasions and the resistance and all that stuff. But they grew up in a very hard school. Let's go to the next one. As you can see here, this is the map today, of course. From Russia's point of view, look what I'm doing. They see this as a knife, a dagger. right? Now, remember this. Hitler did not succeed because he had to start back here. So he spent all the time going through here and all through here. He almost never got to here. And over here, he never did get into Russia. Isn't that interesting what I just said? There was, two halves of the Eastern Front in World War II. People just don't realize this. And Hitler did take over this, and he did get through Belarus, although he had to fight a hard way to get there. And so where I'm pointing right now, he got into Russia proper. Look what I'm doing. Stalingrad. You see, the Russians fought him to the end of the Ukraine, and that's exactly why Stalin said we don't give in here, no matter who we lose. So Stalingrad's all the way over here, Volga River, and that means that they had to spend all their energy taking over the Ukraine. Now, if you were World War II history nuts, which you're not, you know that the German generals argued with Hitler and said, don't waste your time in Ukraine, go here and go to Moscow. Knock him out that way. But Hitler said, this has so much natural resources, I want to take this. And this is fought over by those armchair, guys ever since. But I'm just trying to point that from Putin's point of view, he sees Ukraine as like a threat at him. It's not exactly the same, but it's a little bit along the lines the way you and I see Cuba. Right? Now, Cuba's much smaller and so forth, but you understand what I mean. Now, so Putin therefore basically says that Russia needs Ukraine as a buffer. He needs Russia as a buffer. What does he want? L'chatchila, if he had it his way, they would annex Ukraine, make it part of Russia. That'd be the best from his point of view. B'diavad, if that doesn't work, at least he wants Finlandized. So Finland was also fought hard against the Russians in 1939. There are many parallels between the current war that's happening right now on the one hand and the Russian-Finnish war when Stalin invaded Finland in 1939 and 1940, because the Finns gave him a bloody nose. And if I remember the figures right, I think the Soviets lost 1 million men. That's a lot, okay? They made a lot of mistakes, and they did it the same stupid, blundering kind of way. But in the end, they moved millions, with those big battalions and guns and all that. He busted the Finns. But he respected them as a result of this. I'm simplifying. And therefore, Finland, all during the Cold War, listen to what I'm saying, it's a free country. You can have your own language, your own culture, do whatever you want. Don't do anything to tick off Russia. Don't join the NATO, which wasn't even thought of. Don't do anything we don't like. If Finland want to get a big bomb and Russia said no, they say, okay, we won't. So in other words, you're next door to us, so we will leave you alone if you don't do anything that we disapprove of. That is liberal from the Russian point of view. And by the way, the Finns were in the hands and knees, thank you God for that. Okay? Because Finland, I've been there, has been all 1945, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s during the Cold War. It was a completely free country, all the rest of it. But they never criticized Russia, and you never do this, and so forth. So it's emasculated in that particular regard. And that's what Stalin should say. That's what Putin would say. That's our fallback position. I guess he would want a different government or something like that. And, don't have any threatening army, don't do anything that ticks us off. And a reward for that, I would say that this would be Putin's general plan, in my opinion, since I'm prognosticating, for all those countries, Belarus, the Baltic states, all the rest of it. We don't have to go back to Stalin and we crush you and all the rest of it, but you act accordingly. Mind your manners, okay? Trouble, of course, is, they don't necessarily feel that way. So Putin basically says, let's join together, forget the past. I know there's been some stuff in the past, but let's have a joint future, a joint economy, etc. Let's look to the future. But now let's look at the other side of the mirror. How do Ukrainians see things? You raped us from day one in the 17th century. So don't say, okay, I know it wasn't great the way we started. I agree with that and all the rest, but let's move on and start brand new from today and, there'll be no more of that kind of stuff. Sometimes, as you know in life, a girl might take that offer. But it's also true that she won't. Okay? I don't have nothing to do with you, you chum. And so in order to understand this, we have to go back to sort of the beginning, when the area you and I call Ukraine, which is large, was actually part of Lithuania. Isn't that weird? I did this a couple years ago when we did I think during the Corona maybe, when we did the Jews and Lithuanians. There was a time in the 12, 13, 1400s, you're going to laugh what I'm saying, but I don't mean to. Lithuania was the largest country in Europe, the Grand Duke of Lithuania. And the Jews had it good there, by the way. And as you can see, they conquered and ruled all the way, Belarus, Ukraine, the whole business down to the Black Sea. So in other words, you had an empire from the Baltic to the Black Sea, and it's not Russia, it's not Poland. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So Ukraine was part of that. And I would say, by the way, that the Lithuanians, when they were in charge, were pretty tolerant, and there wasn't religious persecution and that kind of stuff, which is an important part of the story. Eventually, though, it became part of the United Kingdom, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when Poland and Lithuania teamed up, and then things got a little more complicated. But here's the old kingdom of Poland, not Poland today. The Poland I've mentioned many times in my speeches, which once upon a time existed, but no longer does. And it was especially in the 15, 16, 1700s. It was the biggest Jewish community in the world. And that kingdom of Poland, here's Warsaw, included the whole Ukraine. Well, the reason is because the king of Poland married the queen of Lithuania or something like that, Galicia. And so as a result, they combined the two areas. Believe me, the Lithuanians got the short end of the stick, and they haven't forgot it till today. Because we had all this, and all you Poles had this, and you took us over, et cetera, et cetera. So welcome to Eastern Europe. There's no love lost between anybody. Okay? Now, when the Poles took it became the dominant group in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Polish nobles were the Lithuanian nobles that they Polonized, that they psyched out. Both used and misused the Ukrainians as serfs. So notice they experienced the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s as a kind of a slavery, which it was. They also, the Poles, used the Ukrainians as frontier soldiers. This is the Cossacks, who were, look at this. Here's the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which I showed you before. Next to it was a Muslim area, the Tatars of Crimea, which were part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, kind of. So look at the Black Sea. I can't help it. Life is complicated. Here's the Black Sea. Here is all Muslim part. And here's the Polish part. This, by the way, Moldova Wallachia was part of the Muslim part. Yeah, I guess it was. And if you're Polish, so notice this is your border with the Muslims. Every year, the Tatars, this is how they made a living. They would raid into the Christian areas and carry off all the women and the goods and things like that. You know, that's how they did slavery once upon a time. And the Poles, to develop a force against that, made the Cossacks, really. And basically, you do it to them. So in the 1500s and the 1600s, and even a little later than that, A raids B, B raids A. Azay Gatas, and that's how life was lived. That is why all these people are very savage. That's why the Cossacks in Ukraine are very savage. Because when you live frontier style, and the other guys, no holds barred, well, guess what? I have no holds barred. Right? I have no holds barred. It's a little bit like the Marines in Guadalcanal and these places, where they said to the Japanese, oh, you're doing that? We'll do double. You see? You torture our guys? Where do we get a hold of you? That's how life goes. Now, the trouble is, a lot of Jews lived all through here. And I think you know that the Poles were misusing and abusing the Ukrainians, including the Cossacks. It was not a good idea. And eventually the Cossacks said, why should we go back? Why should we fight for these guys against these guys? Let's team up with these guys and fight these guys. So it was like unthinkable that Christians and Muslims would get together. The ethnic hatreds were stronger than the religious. And so this was Khmelnytsky, right? This is the Xeris Takbatat, as we call it in Jewish history. We know about it. The Jews were bit players in all this. But the Jews got really screwed over, and maybe 100,000 possibly got killed or something like that. Who knows how many thousands? And in those horrible ways, which you and I are familiar with as the Cossack massacres, I don't have to review all that stuff. It was, in very brutal and unbelievable. Well, it wasn't brutal for the Ukrainian Tatar border. You know what I'm saying? And by the way, the lucky ones were the ones captured, the Jews, were the ones captured not by these guys, but by these guys, because then they're just sold for slavery down here. So then you have at least a hope that maybe some Jews will ransom you or something like that. That's a whole story by itself, which I can't go into now. Maybe that's the summary. That's interesting. Anyway, of course, as Jews, you and I look to the uprising of 1648 as Xeris Tachvatat as a mitigated Holocaust. But the Ukrainians, until today, look at this as their American Revolution. And to them, Khmelnytsky is their George Washington. And I've seen, and you can too, if you go to Ukraine, you see a lot of statues for Khmelnytsky. Because from their point of view, he's their George Washington who led the fight against the Polish oppressors. Okay? He did horrible things. So did the Poles. Okay? That is the world. We're not dealing with the way you and I understand things over here, thank God. We're dealing with the way it's over there. This is basically, my friends, why your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents moved over here. That's why they moved here. Okay? Now, here comes the point. The Ukrainians under Khmelnytsky attacked and savaged the Poles. And they killed people, and they roasted and toasted them and chopped them in half, and they nailed Catholic priests to the door and then burned the door, and they fried people and all this kind of stuff. And they did worse to the Jews. Okay? So the Poles got really angry, and they said, we're going to double this on you. So I always like to show that scene from With Fire and Sword, which is the Gone with the Wind of Poland, written by Joseph Sienkiewicz, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature for this in 1906. And it's their famous trilogy saga of Polish history, which once upon a time, every Beis Yaakov girl in Sarajner's time used to read this because it's an unbelievably romantic, heavy kind of, this was the forbidden reading of Once Upon a Time. And it's all about, in novel form, the Khmelnytsky uprising and the counterattacks. And the Polish hero is Prince Jeremy Wisniewski, who saved the Jews because they belong to him. You'll see, right? You'll see in a second. And he is determined, as you'll see over here, and he makes an oath as a Catholic. He says, what they've done to me, I swear to you, I'm going to drown the Ukrainian blood. Okay? Now, a few years ago, 20 years ago in Poland, they made a movie out of it. It was actually pretty good. I mean, in terms of historical, I don't know how you can talk about historical accuracy of a novel, but you know what I mean, of the times. Anyway, take a look at this. That's Prince Jeremy. Take my Jews. You'll know where we are. Now he takes his oath in the church. Yeah. And he did it. By the way, I'll say again, the Jewish books always were like a hero, because when he came to a village, if they found old tefillin somewhere, they say, oh, you killed a Jew, wipe out the village. You get it? So this is what they call Tuesday in that part of the world. Now, that means the Cossacks, the Ukrainians, went up the creek. So in desperation, Khmelnytsky did something which turned out to be a big mistake. Okay? And what happens is, he says, the Poles are coming on me like gangbusters. I better ask for help from Russia. From the Tsar. what do you call it, Alexei. Big mistake, okay? Because, what's the expression? The cure is worse than the illness. You get it? You thought you had trouble with Poland? You're calling in the bear to help you against the, the barking dog. Indeed, from the very first day, it was a mess. It's a famous story in Ukrainian history that the Tsar, who's a dictator, sent his officials to the Ukrainians, and what you're supposed to do is like this. They swear allegiance to the king, and then the king swears to adhere to the laws of their constitution. Now, the king swears to uphold their rights. So they swore allegiance to the Tsar, and then he said, I'm not swearing nothing to you. You see? And all of a sudden they realized, okay? So over the next century, and from this time on, the whole Ukraine was never in one country. It was divided among different countries. Half the Ukrainians were in the Russian part because, as you kind of see over here, the Russians invaded Ukraine together with the Ukrainians. Invaded Poland. By the time it's over, without boring you with the details, the Russians annexed this and this. So it's smaller than it was before. This part was annexed by Russia. That means no Jews are there. Because Russia at that time was still old Russia, and no Jews are allowed, not one. No one converted Jew, okay? So that means that the other half of the Ukraine was still in the Kingdom of Poland. That's where the Yidden were. So if you're Jewish, you're in this part of the Ukraine. That's where Hasidism is. The Baal Shem Tov and all those guys in 1700s. The Hasidic movement is not a Polish phenomenon, but it's a Ukrainian phenomenon. Many people don't realize that because it was all the Kingdom of Poland, and I get that. But nevertheless, it took 2 generations for Hasidism spread to Poland, which an average American reader would read and say, I thought the whole thing is Polish, you see? But it's more complicated than that. So, and not only that, Hasidus is a Western Ukrainian phenomenon because the Eastern Ukrainian was in Russia and no Jew was allowed there if you value your life. Okay? So that's just interesting. So the places where the Baal Shem Tov was in Podolia and Lemberg and what do you call it over there? Where was he from? Medjugorje and so forth. They're in what we call Western Ukraine. Okay? Now, the Cossacks, the Ukrainians, realizing that they had switched from the relatively easygoing Poles to the tough Russians, tried to break away. So in other words, I'm talking about these guys over here. You see what I'm saying? Those who would end up in Russia, they say, "Ay, Gewalt." It was better under Poland with all the Tsars of Poland. Okay? But it wasn't that iron fist. And they tried to revolt and break away, but the Tsars crushed them. And they forced them. They turned them into units of the Russian army, the Tsarist army and regime. And therefore, you probably take for granted, the Russians, the Cossacks went and did the pogroms, all the rest of it. The Cossacks were Ukrainian soldiers for the Russian Tsar. And the Russians kind of pressed them to enter the Russian service. And they were frontline troops throughout the 1800s for the Russians down into the 20th century. So in other words, they went into Central Asia, you know what I mean? They did all the conquest and things like this. They were pretty savage to the Jews all the time when they had the opportunity. And it's very much like the Chechens. I think everybody's following the news. They said the Chechens tried to kill Zelensky, right? But they killed the Chechens. Isn't that what we're all reading in the paper, the Ukrainians? Well, the heck with that. The Chechens were almost wiped out by the Russians, 20, 30 years ago? Remember that? They're Muslim. They don't want to be under Russia. But Russia crushed them. Not only crushed them, he got them into his army, right? I don't remember all the names, but they're Muslims. So they're working for Putin now, even though theoretically they shouldn't. So it's very classic Eastern because the Ottoman Turks did this with the Janissaries, for example, which is you take sort of, let us refer to them as POWs, and you enlist them as soldiers in your army, willy-nilly. It's a very Eastern kind of thing, okay? The conclusion of this process came in the 1700s when Catherine the Great, first of all, wiped out the Cossack resistance. This is not so well known. So they used to have a big headquarters called the Sich, and she destroyed it. And so that was the headquarters of their freedom. And second of all, she also took over Poland, most of Poland, which means most of Poland, which therefore means that she annexed to Russia, like Putin wants to do, 90% of the Ukraine. So from the time of, so she's not liked in Russia, in Ukraine. So by the time you get to the late 1700s, the Ukrainians are all the Ukrainians almost are stuck under Russia, and they can't get out. So from then on, until the First World War, Ukraine was part of the Russian Empire, with a very convoluted relationship between the Russians and the Ukrainians. It's true that they weren't under the Catholic Poles, which they hated, because the Catholics tried to Catholicize them, and the Ukrainians are Orthodox. And the Russians are also Orthodox, but the Russians are a different type of Orthodox. Plus, without boring you with the details, the Russian Orthodox Church was busted by Peter the Great, and it became a bureaucracy of the state. So in other words, just take it from me, the Russian state controlled the church. Okay? Now, there's ironies in this with Nicholas and Alexander where they flipped the other way, but we won't go into that. So if I'm confusing you, welcome to Eastern Europe, Now, the Russian state did try to Russianize them. So all during the 1800s, you couldn't speak the Ukrainian language. They tried to crush their literature. They wanted to Russianize them because listen, we're all white. We all look alike. We're all Slavic. That's how they talked. You see? Why can't you just amalgamate with us and be part of Russia? Russia's a big culture, which it was. Russia in the 19th century had a golden age of culture, as you know, music, literature. Think of Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky and all this business. It's true. You see? So why do you want to have this inferior Ukrainian junk? Why don't you join us? Naturally, the Ukrainians, of course, hate that. And they had their hero writers like Shevchenko and others who try to break at them, and some were arrested. It's a constant story. See, this is something completely unknown over here, because why would you know? Only now, I predict, you're going to start to see these in these highbrow magazines when they're going to do a little bit of reading, and then next thing you know, in the Atlantic, whatever, it's, Shevchenko, they never even heard of these things, but that's how it goes. So welcome to my world. So the Russians say, why won't you amalgamate with us? The Ukrainians, of course, said like this, hey, buddy, we have a rich history and culture of our own. Stop crushing us. But it is true that many, many Ukrainians were Russianized. Ad hayom hazeh. And so you read in the papers that there are many places in Ukraine where the people talk Russian. The Jews, by the way, if they're going to pick up a Galicia language, will pick up Russian in the 1800s, 1900s. Because let's put it this way. You learn Russian, you have access to all the Russian stuff. And they're the ones who rule. If you learn Ukrainians, you just learn a dialect of some hated population that's going nowhere. You see? Which, of course, makes the Ukrainians hate the Jews. Welcome to the Gullus. Welcome to the Gullus. This is how it goes. So the Jews who live in the Ukraine area will mainly be Russianized intellectuals. The most famous name that comes to my mind off the top of my head would be Jabotinsky, who's from Odessa. So therefore, you want to get technical about it. It's in the Ukraine. But he was so Russian, and he was such an excellent writer in Russian, and he completely identified with the Russian language, and most of Jabotinsky. And most of the writings that he did in life were in Russian, not in Ivrit, and things like this. He edited the newspaper Razviet and things like that. Because I told you, see? Now, he knew what I'm talking about, obviously, and he actually sympathized with the Ukrainians. But if you want to talk about, culture, it's going to be Russian. So it's a mess, okay? As for the Jews of the Ukraine, which were several million, that's the place where there was a baby boom. In the 19th century. I think I told you the world population, I'm talking about the world Jewish population, quintupled in the 1800s and 1900s, before Hitler. If the early numbers were like 3 million, by the time you get to 1930s, it's like 15 million, 16 million. So it was a quintupling of the Jewish population in a little over a century, which is extraordinary. Now, and one of the main, let me put it this way, they weren't having a lot of babies in England or France or Germany. They were westernized. Is Eastern Europe. And a big part of Eastern Europe is Ukraine, since we're talking about that today. Now, the Jews are part of the Pale of Settlement, and the Ukraine was part of the Pale of Settlement. It's ironic. When the Russians annexed, you see these places in the news, that's why I'm telling you this. When the Russians annexed the Ukraine, Catherine the Great, so she said, okay, so it's no longer a situation where half is Russian, half is Polish. It's all mine. So I'll tell you what, I will let the Jews, if they want to, move into the parts of the Ukraine that we didn't let them move into until now. So it's surprising that Kiev had Jews until Khmelnytsky, and then they didn't for 150 years because it was that part of Russia. And then when the Russians took over the whole business, they cast them to the grave. So okay, in 1793, the Jews can move to Kiev. You see, which becomes, of course, a major Jewish center, among other things. So you got to know these things. What can I tell you? The problem, of course, is the Jewish population grew, but the economy didn't. We're talking about Russia, which was fairly backwards. Therefore, you had a lot of poverty, unemployment, and all the junk that we associate with Eastern Europe. I don't have time to go into this now. I think I may have mentioned in the past. There's a very good book, if you're at all interested, called The New History of the Shtetl by Professor Yochanan Petrovsky Stern, who's a Ukrainian guy, Jewish guy, from guy actually. But he's Ukrainian, see? He's the Russians, you see? And he wrote this book a number of years ago, and he knows the heck what he's talking about. He can read all these languages and so forth. I think he's in Northwestern University, possibly. And you see, as I've mentioned here many times, in the old kingdom of Poland, the Jews, everybody was doing fairly well. The Jews had the Goyim, because the whole country was one gigantic flea market. I know it sounds funny to us today, and it is kind of funny, but that is how life was lived. So everybody's house, every street, every shul, of course, every church, and this and that and the other, was handling and hawking. And so I would walk, this is how life was lived by our ancestors. So, I have some feathers that I recently acquired, you have some wax, let's say, you have this, what do you need? You need jewelry, I'll talk to him, we'll get the jewelry, we agree on the price. And in this primitive, super capitalistic way, you could get whatever you wanted at a fairly reasonable price. You could sell whatever you wanted at a fairly reasonable price. And the Polish landlords who owned the whole thing took their percentage off the top. But everybody else was, I would say, fairly well off. There wasn't a large poverty class. The Russian officials, and this guy has the Russian, when they came to Ukraine, they said, wow, this place is like rich, They weren't used to this, you see? And even though it's like, and it offends the Russian bureaucratic mentality because all this hawking going on. So the famous story we've all heard goes back to the 1700s, which is, Nishtav Shabbos Geret, how much is the horse? Nishtav Shabbos Geret, it's this and that. That's a joke from the 1700s. You understand? That's a joke from the 1700s. And by the way, all members of the family were operating in this. This is how it went. There's a famous story where a Russian official comes in and says, everybody told me, do you have a bag of gold in your house? Where is it? And he said, meet my wife. And the guy wasn't being romantic. She was a good businessman. That's what it means. You get it? So it was a different world. The Russians come in and just change everything. And they mess up the economy. And so you have an expanding Jewish population with fewer and fewer economic opportunities. And you can imagine what that did. So in the 1880s, what you and I call the Russian pogroms that I did a series on a couple years ago, the famous pogroms of 1881, 1882, Ukrainian. It's actually taking place in southern Ukraine. You see? And that puts the spin on it. Southeastern Ukraine. On the other hand, Ukraine has the best topsoil in the world. We all learned this when we were in 7th or 8th grade. Okay? And they produced a veldt of crops. Notice it's incredibly agriculturally productive, but the czarist state always bought most of it and sold it overseas for foreign currency. So the people who should have gotten rich with the locals didn't get rich. It was the state. The state didn't get rich either because they're always borrowing more than they could pay for. Today, Russia depends on the oil, as I think we all know from the news reports. If Putin gets a hold of the Ukraine, in addition to the oil, they'll be able to export grain and things like that because it has the best soil in the world. Now, the czars, of course, I say, therefore, as you can see what I mean, treated the Ukraine in a colonialist fashion. That's why they say to Putin, they said, well, you raped us, you understand? And this is the reason why all these Jews and Christians moved to the West. It's not only Jews from Ukraine that moved to America. There's a ton, if you know, you've been around, especially in the Midwest, by the way, especially in the Midwest, a lot of Ukrainian communities, okay? Now they came to this country, or Canada, nobody bothers you, right? And so that's why they moved here. I haven't told the whole story because there was a part of the Ukraine, a small part, which was not in the Russian Empire. This is a part with a big Jewish population. This smaller part of the Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It's Eastern Galicia. So now you're going to understand what we mean, and people usually don't, when we talk about Galicianer. It doesn't really mean the whole province of Galicia, but it really means the eastern part of the province of Galicia. That's the Galicianers, okay? And this is a matter of maps. I can't help it. So here's the Austro-Hungarian Empire. What's about it? Franz Josef's empire. This is the Austria part. This is the Hungary part. Galicia is over here that I'm pointing to, as you can see, up here if you prefer. It's up against the Russian border. This is the western part of Galicia, where Krakow is and places like that. Here's the eastern, what I'm doing over here, the eastern part of Galicia. If you are any Galicianers in the audience and relatives, then they come almost certainly from the eastern half, places like Belz and, I don't know, this, that, and the other, all these little, Lemberg, Lvov, the Hasidic territories. So it's very interesting to us because it had a gigantic Jewish population. It's the half the province. So actually, the Galicianers, as we call them, were in Ukraine. Do you get what I'm saying? In other words, the province of Galicia, which was seized by the Austrians in 1772, was a big area. Half of it, this eastern half over here, is Ukrainian. The landlords and the nobles were Polish. So the Poles called it part of the Polish kingdom. And the Jews who lived there at that time made their living usually by working for the landlords and the great princes. So the population on the street was Ukrainian, the ruling class was Polish, and the Jews are in the middle. There you go again. So most people think the Ukrainians are Polish, but if your family is Polish, then you'll know, who I think Naftali, you told me the other day, he's a mixed marriage. One parent was a Polish and one was a Galicianer. But somebody else doesn't understand what that means. Well, now you do. Okay? And so those are from this part here, Krakow and such places, no Ukrainians, all Polish. All Polish. Auschwitz is over there, by the way. All Polish. And the culture is intensely Polish. And the level of the peasants is higher. It's just interesting. And it's a different experience, you see? You go over here, it's more what they call halb Asian, half Asia. It's wilder. In Austrian Empire, they called them the Ruthenians. That's their word for the Ukrainians. Ruthenians. I'm going to tell you something that'll surprise you right now. Munkac is in the Ukraine, right? It's not part of Hungary. Munkac's like over here. It's interesting because it was an area that later on was made part of the Kingdom of Hungary, but it's actually a Ukrainian kind of thing. And so if you lived in Munkac or close to these kind of places, again, the ruling class will be Hungarian, but the people you meet in the street, the peasants, are actually Ukrainian. They're the Hungarians, the Austro-Hungarians are trying to get rid of their culture, and you got the Jews in the middle. But again, if you're Jewish, and you live in Lemberg, not Lvov, not Lviv, it's the 19th century, you live in Lemberg, why the heck you want to learn Ukrainian? You learn German, you have access to all that culture and business opportunities and so forth and so on. But if you're Ukrainian, then you say the Jews are our enemies because they're siding with our oppressors. Have I made this complicated enough? Okay. Now, that means that in the 19th century, in Galicia, which means Eastern Galicia, the Ukrainians are the underdogs, the Poles are the top dogs, and the Jews were in the middle who were depending on Franz Josef, the emperor, to protect them, which he did. Okay? So they looked to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that's our savior. So the soldiers there, the police, are among other things protecting the Jews. Otherwise, the locals will riot and do a mini Khmelnytsky. This is why the Jews there liked Franz Josef. You understand? Matter of fact, there's a famous video, I think I showed it once before. Hopefully you forget everything. They made, it's great. There was an Czech miniseries, an Austrian miniseries on the famous Radetzky March, which is a famous novel by Joseph Roth, who's among the most, a Jewish guy, among the most famous Austrian novelists about the time of Franz Josef. And they made a miniseries about it. And you'll see him in a second, the old Emperor Franz Josef, like 1910, driving through the streets in Galicia, you think that the Goyim are Polish, they're Ukrainian. Although you see a lot of Jews. Look at this. Here's the emperor driving a car. Look at all the people in the street. And the ones who are not Jewish are Ukrainians. And obviously, the Hasidic dressed ones and so forth are the Jews. Well, she's got her head covered. Well, you can't tell. In Eastern Europe, everybody covers their head. You know? And see this? These are the Ukrainians. Here's the Jewish guys. Right? And it's very accurate. You know, it's very interesting. And so forth. He was certainly popular among the Jews. Okay? But now you can sort of understand why. Okay? It's kind of cool. All right? But my point is, it's Ukraine. Okay? It's Ukraine. Now, legally, it's Poland. And the ruling class, the politics in the 19th century is that only the Poles can vote. You see what I'm saying? And the Ruthenians resent this, and the Jews usually voted for the Poles, which they hated by the Ukrainians, unless you're a Zionist. And then you're a Zionist, you say, I'm going to vote for a Jewish party. The Ukrainians like that. You understand? That I understand. You're Jewish, you're voting for a Jewish cause. So don't help the Poles. Don't hurt us. So basically, the bottom line of all this kind of things is that the Ukrainians were screwed over both in the Russian Empire and in Galicia. But those are the two places where they lived. The Ukrainians were in the Russian Empire and in Galicia. Okay? Now, in World War I, the German army physically conquered the whole Ukraine. That's called World War I in the Eastern Front. In 1915, they got this. In 1916, they conquered this. 1917, they conquered this. And by the time it's all over, the Russians had to buckle. You know, the Germans had physically occupied the whole of or just about the whole of the Ukraine. The Tsar fell from power in early 1917. And for a short time, for a few months, they had a liberal government. This is the only time before Yeltsin. And the Ukrainians immediately said, we want to get divorced from Russia. And Alexander Kerensky, who was a liberal, he said, okay, if that's what you want. You know, we're liberals. We don't want to force anybody in a relationship. And you can have your own country. It's a lot more complicated than I'm saying, but I'm not going to bore you with 1,000 details. Let's go to the next one. The Germans created a kind of a kingdom of Ukraine. They hoped would have a German king for their own purposes, keep it as a buffer away, but Ukrainians should be happy. The Ukrainians had to have their own council and then their other councils. It's very weird. At that time, Lenin and Trotsky took over the Russia part. They started as, you know, the USSR. From day one, they said, sure, we recognize Ukraine. But then they sent in communists to set up what we call Ukrainian communist country, you know. And the situation got so complicated, there were like 15 armies running across, fighting each other, all in 1919, 1920. The German army had to pull out when they lost the First World War, a tremendous civil war, simultaneous wars of the Ukrainians against Lenin and Trotsky, against Poland, against the white Russians who were trying to restore the Tsar, against this army and that army. It was nuts. And it was a chaos, and 100,000 Jews were killed. That's when it happened. Again, I assume everybody knows what I'm talking about. This is not the Holocaust at all. This is 1919, 1920, when in the context of this chaos that I just described, you had all these Ukrainian armies, A, B, C, E, F, and G. So I'm not going to say all of them did it, but some did. And they shechted 100,000 Jews in 1919, 1920. The American Jewish community, Woodrow Wilson sent an American Jewish delegation to investigate. They killed a delegation. This, the famous Professor Friedlander from the Jewish Theological Seminary, was murdered this way. Okay? And this is what happened. Now, by the time the dust settled, by the way, the yeshivas had run away to Ukraine to escape the German army invading here. Then all this broke out. If you know the yeshiva lore, Rabbi Rudin and the other, they barely got out of Ukraine to get back to Lithuania. You know, I mean, they're like, that was a real place you want to get out of. But anyway, by the time the dust settled, the Ukrainians found themselves screwed over again, because now it was under Soviet Union. By the time I'm not going to give you all the details. This is not a seminar, but just take it from me. By the time you get to 1921, 22, this army's knocked out, blah, blah, blah. The only one left standing is the Red Army, with like 95% of the Ukraine in there. So basically, we're back to the Tsarist Empire. Of course, Lenin and Trotsky, it's not the Tsarist Empire. It's a free situation. as a workers' paradise, as we all know. But you can understand from the point of view of the Ukrainians, it's even worse than the Tsar, because the Tsar at least was religious, was a Christian. These guys are atheists. They killed all the priests, burned the churches, and so forth and so forth. Plus, they killed the landowners and the capitalists and all that kind of business. Once again, a small portion was outside of Russia, not in, I didn't get the map for this, not in Austria-Hungary, because Austria-Hungary didn't exist, but was in the Republic of Poland, the Pilsudski Poland in the 20s and 30s. This is Baranovich and these kind of places. Oh no, that's in the northern part. There were whole areas of the border that belonged to Poland for a certain reason because of the war. So there are Ukrainians there, and then most of the Ukrainians are on the other side in the Soviet Union. Now, both countries mistreated the Ukrainians, who therefore fiercely hated them and dreamed of revenge. So if you're a Ukrainian guy living in the 1920s and 30s, you can imagine how you feel about Stalin, but they also felt that way about Poland, okay? They also felt that way about Poland. The Poles didn't trust them. It was a poisonous relationship. In the new USSR, to add insult to injury, not only are they being crushed, but they had to pretend they like it. We love you, Mrs. Hannigan, okay? Well, isn't the Soviet Union the best place in the world with the best food and the best this? Oh, you don't think so? Come here. That's right. So that made him even more, you understand? Think of it. Now, if you're Jewish and you live in Ukraine in the 1920s, Jews flocked to the Communist Party. That's the new group in charge. If you're religious, you get persecuted. Jobs galore. Because, you're setting up a new state in a place called Ukraine, Russia. 99% of the Gentile population is illiterate. You need bureaucrats, things like this. The Jews bring in literacy, and that's communication skills. And it is what it is. And there's a huge part of the communist government and apparatus and bureaucracy in the 20s especially, places like Ukraine are going to be Jewish. You can imagine how that makes the Ukrainians feel. Okay? You can imagine how that works. By the way, these are all ex-Hasidim, you understand. They also, in addition to flourishing in the new job opportunities, the communist government did protect the Jewish population from mob violence. You get it? That's a fact. They're in favor of law and order. So everything I just described intensified the Ukrainian hatred for the Jews, which had never been asleep. The Ukrainians hated the Russians so much, both on nationalist grounds as well as religious grounds. Stalin realized this, and he got to hate the Ukrainians so much that he mass murdered them. This is called the Holodomor, the mass starvation. In other words, in 1931-32, Stalin took away all their food from huge areas in Ukraine of the farmers. They just went there after the crops and took all the food, the animals, the wheat, and everything like this, and goodbye. And so there's no food. And so millions of people starved to death. That's what the Ukrainians say like this. What did the Jews always tell me at the show? We had our own. They call it the Holodomor, which means the famine. But it's a famine on purpose. You get what I'm saying? It was induced. And if you were somebody in the countryside, you tried to get into a city with food, the guards wouldn't let you enter the city. So basically, you drop dead. So you can just imagine, I'm surprised you don't know this, imagine whole areas in which you go there after a little while, it's a ghost town. In other words, when I say ghost town, you see the dead bodies everywhere. It's a certain type of horror movie, isn't it? Like something we used to see on what am I thinking about? The Twilight Zone or something like that? No, but it happened, okay? So, again, Putin says today, let's forget all about it and let's start new. Right? And the Russians, I'm not exactly sure how they deal with this. They can't totally deny it, but, they'll say like this, it wasn't millions, it was a few thousand, that kind of shtick, okay? The Jews, who mostly live in the cities, did not starve. That increases the anger and the hatred between the two sides. In general, Stalin hated the Ukrainians and was hated by them. And therefore, if you're Ukrainian, that was a black mark against you. And he used to purge the Communist Party of Ukraine every once in a while, just shoot them all. The guy who did all the shooting for him was Khrushchev. That's how Khrushchev rose to power. He was Stalin's henchman in Ukraine to starve the people and kill them and shoot them, this and that and the other. And that's the people they liked. You understand? So it was a crazy time. As a result of this poisoned atmosphere, Ukrainian emigre groups flourished in Nazi Germany. When Hitler comes to power, Hitler already written in Mein Kampf, one day I'm going to knock out Soviet Russia. He writes that. If you're Ukrainian, you figure like it's good. And then we'll get a new Ukraine back. He had all these Ukrainian groups. I can totally understand it. You have all these Ukrainian groups operating in Berlin and places like that in the 1930s, making plans underground, above ground, to set up a Ukrainian state. Finally, we'll get our freedom. Finally, we get our independence, thanks to this tzaddik called Hitler. He was the great white hope, as you see. The emigres, and especially, you can understand living in Nazi Germany, but I don't think they needed that. They plan, when they take over, to purge the Ukraine of all the bad groups, the Poles, the Russians, the Jews. And then it'll just be us. You understand? You hear where they're coming from, okay? Now, never turns out the way you plan it. In September and October of 1939, at the end of the 30s, when Hitler and Stalin cut a deal, they had what they called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There's the picture, right? That's Stalin with his best friend, Hitler's foreign minister. And they made a deal, and the deal included, a big part of it was to give Stalin the Ukrainian parts of Poland. It also took more, but that was a major part of it. Matter of fact, if you look it up, you'll see Stalin said, we're not invading Poland, we're just coming to Ukraine to liberate the Ukraine. That was a genius part on his part, because since he said, I'm not attacking Poland, so that means England and France don't have to be at war with him. So Hitler said, I'm attacking Poland, so he got England and France and eventually America against him. Right? It's interesting. In doing this, Stalin nearly fulfilled a long-standing Russian goal, the annexation of the whole of Ukraine for the first time ever. So basically, Stalin picked up this area, is the Belarus part, and what I'm talking about over here. This is Belz, this is Lvov, this is Zalkiv. I mean, it's a ton of Jewish communities over here. It's Brody, it's Uman, it's a big Jewish area, okay? It's Berdyshev. You've heard of these names, of course. It's all from Eastern Galicia. Now it falls under Stalin. So, you know what he does? Between late 1939 and June of 1941, he purges those areas, and he's killing everybody right and left. But you see, that means that there has been a time when the whole of the Ukraine was very properly annexed to Russia. And you see, we did a great favor. You Ukrainians used to be divided among different countries. But thanks to us, you're now all one big happy family. That's how Putin talks. I want to take over Ukraine and make it all one big happy family with the Russians, and you won't be divided in different areas and subject to Western influence and all the rest of it. Maybe Stalin did it a little bit rough. That's what I'll say, played a little bit rough. But, the basic outline was good. The Ukrainians, of course, seethe, because you have to understand, the NKVD rounded up hundreds of thousands of people, shot them in the basement, deported the other ones to, Siberia and such places like that. It was a horror for them, okay? And then Hitler shows up in 1941. This is Hitler's invasion of Russia. Ukraine is part of that. And he did conquer the Ukraine. I'll tell you, he got as far as Stalingrad, which means he took over the whole Ukraine, okay? Now, the Ukrainians said like this, hooray, our liberation is over here. I was going to show you a movie, but we weren't able to, for technical reasons, to get it up there, a clip. But I hope to by the time we get to the YouTube, if you want to see the better version. Again, I did show this once before. There's a Polish movie, which they made, I think, in 2017, called Volyn, which is an area of Poland. No, it's actually half Poland, half Ukraine. You see the point? See the problem? It's half and half. And I'll repeat, this is a Polish movie, and it shows, it's a very good movie too, and it shows in dramatic form how the Ukrainians massacred the Poles in unbelievably horrible ways in the middle of World War II. So in other words, while everybody's fighting them, they have their local fights. But meanwhile, the clip I was going to show you now was that the Germans show up in the town, the Ukrainians greet them, Everything's great. The Germans say, "Where are the Jews?" They show them the Jews and they shoot them. The Germans shoot them. And that's the end of that. So this happened again and again all over the Ukraine. It's the beginning of what we call the Holocaust, of course.
Franek, wracaj! Mosiek!
Wir begrüßen die deutsche siegreiche Armee mit großer Freuen und Dankbarkeit. У нас є брама, і ви повинні були їхати від заводця. А то нічого. Прошу. Wir freuen und dass unser neuer ukrainischer Stadt und Groß Deutschland zusammen. Хай живе Організація українських націоналістів, хай живе Степан Бандера, хай живе фюрер Адольф Гітлер!
Gibt es hier im Dorf noch irgendwelche Juden?
Es fehlen noch Kinder. Ein Junge und 2 Mädchen.
Schmei Israel.
Los, die anderen finden. Und dann alle vergraben. Tam jest. Wo sind die?
So they thought that this is an opportunity to set up our own state and purge the country of minorities, especially the Jews. They were 50% right. It's an opportunity to purge the country, but it's not going to be their own country because they're being played by Hitler and company. You see, but nevertheless, this is how it went, and I can just tell you, maybe the worst place. I'm going to make quite a statement now. Maybe the worst place to be in the Holocaust was the Ukraine, because what they did to people. Ordinarily, I wouldn't even show the picture, but since we're talking about this subject tonight, you just get off the Yad Vashem on the line, and you can see it's very brutal. These women and others being torn to bits by the Ukrainian crowd. I mean, look at this, right? Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. The boy, they have their hands and knees, and I mean, it speaks for itself. Look at her. You understand? And these are done by the Ukrainians, not the Germans.
Хай ростуть обоє разом, аж до самих жнив. А в жнива я накажу жницям позбирати на перше цей кукілю снопки та спалити, а пшеницю направити до мене в клунь.
Нехай в усіх обрядах. А коли того буде треба, то й на усіх мовах нехай люди проголошують Слово Боже.
Брати і сестри, ми маємо очистити українську землю.
Niech wioski, które mają murowane domy, albo korzystne, dobre dla obrony okolice, przyjmują wszystkich Polaków pod swoje dachy.
Trzeba mi się dostać do rodziny. Znacie jakiego pewnego Ukraińca?
Zdobywajcie broń
Pomsy.
Jednoczcie się. Organizujcie samoobronę. Nie możecie czekać, aż was powyżynają.
Треба наповнити ріки і озера польською кров'ю. Бо Україна має бути чиста, як шклянка води.
Не завагаєшся виконати найнебезпечнішого чину.
Я Отця, Сина, Святого Духа. Амінь. Я Отця і Сина, і Святого Духа. Амінь. То нехай ваші жнива будуть врожайними.
Прийматимеш ворогів твоєї нації.
Прийматимеш ворогів твоєї нації!
Слава Україні! Слава Україні!
Synem swoim nas
Okay, and just multiply this a millionfold. I'm sorry to say this, I'm not happy to have, of course not. But you just know what your parents, grandparents, and people in Shul and their parents ran away from. And this is what happened to people's relatives. And this is what the Ukrainians did, not the Germans. Okay? Things like this. But at least what the Ukrainians obviously were moving under the idea, even if we get messed over by Hitler, at least we'll get rid of the Jews. Okay? And we'll get rid of the Poles, in which you see they cut the Poles apart, they burn them, burn children, pull people apart like with horses, things like this. And it worked. I mean, they killed them. So the Poles, if they want to go that way, can say, we had a Holocaust too, you know what I mean? Now, not in the 6 million number, but a lot. Eventually, to make the whole thing worse from the Ukrainian point of view, well, let me make this a point. Hitler betrayed them. As it turned out, they misread him. He didn't plan to set up a Ukrainian state. He planned to win the war, kill the Ukrainians, and then move Germans in there in Kharkov-Vasula, in virgin territory. You have a huge area of the world. It's the best soil. The Germans will really know how to do it right. You can't compare the Ukrainians with the organized Germans, which in a twisted way was, you hear where he's coming from. And that is his idea of paradise. That was the Hitlerian utopia. That the East, especially Ukraine, with all this oil and grain, and I don't know, this, that, and the other, will be part of Germany. This is like the Iker part of who he was. So the Ukrainians simply didn't get that. Now, it never quite happened that way because he didn't win the war. So he didn't have an opportunity. He was fighting until Stalingrad, in late 42. And from then on, the Russians start pushing back. You see? The Russians push them back. So to make things worse, eventually Stalin returns in total triumph. It's called the end of World War II. Stalin returns in complete triumph. It was the worst nightmare for the Ukrainians. And believe me, many Ukrainians continued to battle Soviet forces. I'll say it again, the Ukrainians continued to battle Soviet forces until around 1950, 51, 52. So these were wars that Stalin was able to keep out of the press. I don't know if anybody knew about it, but there was like major battles going on of the Ukrainians. They didn't want to give in. And then they conducted what we would call today urban terror campaign and things like this. And it was a bloody business, but they were messing with the wrong guy. They're messing with Stalin, He was so angry, he wanted to kill all the Ukrainians, as he did to other groups, because there's X number of groups in the World War II where Stalin killed them all out, right? Or he deported the Tatars and the Chechens to Siberia and left them there and all the rest of it. The day after he won the Battle of Stalingrad, he deported a whole bunch of groups. That's how the guy operated. Khrushchev tells us this in his memoirs. Stalin said like this, doggone it, there are too many Ukrainians to kill, There's too many of them. You see? So that's how you go. But nevertheless, another 1 million Ukrainians died in a famine in 1946 after the war. This is simply the idea. Stalin would never say, oh, we're starving over here, we need to import grain from the West. Better to keep that quiet and let them die. So again, if you're Ukrainian, you were either killed in this war, this famine, or this, that, and the other, as you can see. And so you can understand from the Ukrainian point of view. Let's go to the next one. The memory of Stalin is pretty strong. On the other hand, Stalin did say, look, I created a single large Ukraine containing all the pieces, even Munkach. So the piece that used to call Podka Rus is Subcarpathian Ruthenia, Ruthenia being Ukraine, was now added to the Soviet Union. The only lucky Ukrainians in the 1920s and 30s was the one in the Munkach area. Because that little piece of Ukraine, which had formerly been part of the Kingdom of Hungary, that little piece of the Ukraine was in Czechoslovakia from 1920 to 1939. Czechoslovakia was a democratic country, so they had it good. Now it was poverty, but it's good. And I think many of you have seen that picture, that movie of the Munkacher Rebbe's daughter's wedding, right? I think most people have seen that. And you can see that, it was a fairly good life. The Jews had it good. The local Ruthenians had it pretty good. And they were not oppressed. And you had your own language, because Czechoslovakia was a very liberal country. But that's over with World War II, because technically Hitler gave it back to Hungary, and then Stalin took it and made it part of Ukraine. So today, as we speak now, Munkach and Chus and all those areas are not in Hungary, but they're in Ukraine. If you want to get over, you have to cross at Bergsaz, and to get into Hungary itself. I did it a couple years ago. And so the border saying, see, you don't know this because you don't live there. You're supposed to know where Richmond is, where Buena Vista, Virginia is. But there they know the borders are changing all the time. Okay? So Stalin said, I guess, I finally did you guys a favor. I bring the whole Ukraine in one piece. And I got Stalin, after World War II, kicked out in a rough way all the Poles and all the gypsies, or something like that. Notice all the minorities. So all you have is Ukrainians and Jews. Okay? Can't help that. We tried to kill them out. They killed about 1 or 2 million Jews. Still was about 1 million left in Ukraine. Something like that. You'll see the numbers shortly. And therefore, I did you guys a favor. So Putin would say like this, what do you have against Stalin? He gave you so much territory. You see? I know, he played a little rough. Like I said, played a little rough. Wasn't touch football. Wasn't touch football. But listen, he did you guys a favor. So, well, let's put it this way. The Poles were all deported, and most of the Jews were dead. That's about as close you can get to Ukrainian heaven, And Khrushchev, when he was the head of Russia, added the Crimea. He gave him a present in 1954. He said, I'm giving you the Crimea to add to Ukraine, which, by the way, Putin is super angry at, okay? In spite of everything I just said, the 45 years of 1945 to 1990, although peaceful, right? I mean, there weren't any wars, were hated by the Ukrainians. They didn't like being under the Soviet Union for a whole bunch of reasons, religious as well as ethnic. Therefore, if you follow what I said tonight, the first opportunity they get in the years 1988 to 1992, under Gorbachev, right? The first opportunity they get, no, not yet. Oh yeah, okay, you show that. The Ukraine declared independence, spurning a Russian offer to remain united on good terms with the Ukraine. So when the Soviet Union became dissolved, Russia said, let's renegotiate and have a completely fair, democratic, confederation of Russia and Ukraine, not on the old bases, all the rest. They said, no, no. Now, this is, I think, interesting. Look at the numbers of Jewish population in Ukraine. If you go back to Khmelnytsky's time, after the massacre, there's about 40,000 left. 100 years later, it was a huge baby boom. Look at those numbers. From over 100 years, from 40,000 to, it's incredible. It's a 7-fold increase. And then, if you get 1800s, it's 2.6. This is what I mean by the baby boom, right? And then it all remains around 2.7 million, up to Hitler. Hitler, of course, killed all these people, so after the war, you still have 840,000. It's not 2.7 million, okay? And some left to Israel and moved to other places like that, including my daughter-in-law's family. They moved from Ukraine to Moldova. You see, moved from Ukraine to Moldova for business, for parnasa reasons. So there are Jews from Ukraine in the USSR who moved to other parts of the USSR, but still have 750,000. That's a lot. Some are moving to Israel, as you can see. By the time we get to Gorbachev and Yeltsin, it's almost 500,000. Whoop! They all go to Israel. Look at that. Yeah. As soon as they have a chance, look at those numbers. I'm making Aliyah. So they're a big part of the million Russian Jews that come to Israel. They're not exactly Russian, although you know what I mean. Today, these are the numbers they calculate, 70, 60, 70. I don't know if they're accurate. I've seen higher numbers, I've seen lower numbers, but it gives you a general idea, right, of what's going on. There was a huge baby boom, then was Hitler, then the communists, and then Aliyah. Okay? Aliyah. Now, the fact that Yeltsin, who I talked about earlier this semester, permitted this reflects the high watermark of genuine Russian liberalism. He was a liberal. He said, if you don't want to be here, we're not going to force you to be here. You want to set up your own country, set up your own country. The same liberalism that you and I saw regard to the Jews. Yeltsin said all the Jews can go to Israel if you want to. That's a fact. Russia changed. We spoke about that at great length. It was not the Soviet Union. They said if the Jews want to go to Israel, they can go to Israel. That's a liberal. You want to stay, you stay. You don't want to stay, you can go. You want to come back, you can come back like that. Okay? This attitude is to the horror of traditional Russian nationalists, which is the school of Putin. So Putin's horrified at everything that he got so liberal. Now, mind you, Putin is not a communist. I want to be clear about that. He's a Russian. He analyzes communism and that era in their history from the point of view of whether or not it served Russia. So from that angle, Putin will say, let's go to the next guy. Stalin was pretty good. He expanded Russia's borders. Again, he played hardball. That's true. And we're not happy with the fact he killed everybody, and certainly they destroyed the church, all the rest of it. But Stalin was a great Russian leader. Look what he made Russia rise to, which is true, rise to the top. When it was the USSR, it was two major superpowers. Agreed? Three if you want to argue. But, he was at the top. Okay? So, as a Russian, and Stalin wasn't Russian. He said, as a Russian, I know that. That's why I just said he's not Russian. Yeah, he's really Ossetian. Anyway, 1 second. So from a Russian national point of view, Stalin was a Gavra. You see? Like that. Lenin, if you know what happened in the 1920s, Lenin, to make it look good, said Ukraine will be part of Russia, and we'll give part of the Russian part to the Ukraine. And it didn't matter to him. It's all part of, it's all baloney, get it? It's all under the communist dictatorship. But that means that today, those territories, like the Donbass, part of Ukraine and Russia, and Putin said, like, who gave Lenin the right to do this? So he's not talking about whether or not Lenin was a religious man, a nice guy, whether he liked his dogs, whether communism was a good idea, whether it was an efficient system for the redistribution of wealth, et cetera, et cetera. He took Russian land. They gave it to his Mamzer Ukrainians, you see? Khrushchev, who gave him the right to give the Crimea to the Ukraine? He just decided to do that. The Crimea is Russian territory, at least ever since Catherine the Great. And if you remember, about 10 years ago, he conquered Ukraine. Isn't that right? America let him get away with it. I mean, I beg, you know what I mean, the Crimea. And his China was, there was just a stupidity on the part of Khrushchev, like that. Yeltsin, why'd you let Ukraine go? I'm just giving you a little bit of an idea. I don't have to be a psychologist to understand this about Putin. That's the way the Russian nationalists see their history, okay? So all this was torn away from them in a fit of liberal mishigas. We could have renegotiated things so that they would all stay in one country, and we're not going to keep up the Stalinist system. We're not going to persecute religious people anymore. As you know, Putin doesn't even bother the Lubavitch. You see? We're not doing anything like that. We're not having communism. We're having capitalism. We're having this. So let's keep all the countries that used to be part of the Russia big thing, and not without and minus all the stuff that you really hate. Okay? So it reflects how Russia is different than Western Europe. Western Europe has given up this territorial obsession. under American tutelage. This is something the Americans taught them after World War II. Truman, these guys, did them a big favor. They said, look here, we can't intervene every 10 years in a war between France and Germany. Get along. And guess what? If you get along, it'll be better for everybody. You'll both be better off. This was a chiddush, when General Marshall said that, it's like giving a drunk water. What is this? They never thought of that. And you and I know it led to all the peace and the prosperity within Western Europe. Okay? And the Europeans picked up the ball until they got, let's go to the next one. Here's de Gaulle and Adenauer. You would never imagine this in the old days. This is thanks to the USA. They used to get together and say, let's be friends now. Let's try that. Okay? We have this, you have that, we have this economy. It's called the common market, the European Union, all that junk. And let's go that way. Let's try that. This is not for Russia. You get it? This is not how Putin sees things. Okay? Those who were with me in the last trip, I know that we did. When we went to Vienna, anybody here? Yeah. I don't know if you remember, when you crossed the border from Austria into Hungary, after Shabbos, we traveled to Budapest. You don't even stop at the border. I don't know if you know this. It's all done on your cell phone. We had our tour person had to have everybody's passport number or something like this, and you just send it to the Hungarian authorities, and the bus never stopped. When I was in Eastern Europe, they make you wait 6 hours when you cross from Lithuania into Belarus, and they make you wait close to 9 hours. 9 hours when you cross from Belarus into Ukraine. And that's with a driver who knew how to give out bottles of booze to the guy over here. If you didn't do that, who knows how long it is? Huh? Yeah. And that's how they do business in that part of the world. Get it? That's how they do business in that part of the world. By the way, I'll tell you something ironic. We were Americans, so we had American passport. You need American visa. You have to send them. Like I remember for Belarus, I had to mail them my physical passport. That's right. I had to mail them my physical passport, and then they came back stamped with all that junk, whatever. And meanwhile, of course, they get to see everything I've ever. Now, I'm not a spy, so I have nothing to hide. But I'm just telling you, this is how it works over there. You understand? So they're not Western Europe. They didn't have the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan and all the common market and all that kind of stuff. It's a different business. So it's inconceivable to the Russian nationalists or to Putin, you cross from one country to the other, just by typing in your name and who you are. Huh? That's crazy. Okay? Now, how did all of this play out for the Jews in Ukraine? Rather well, for the first time in history. And for a number of different reasons. Notice I'm raising the question, how did the events of 1988, 1992, the change away from communism, how did it affect the Jews who remain in the Ukraine? And it's good, relatively speaking, for a number of reasons. First of all, the Ukrainians themselves, given the history I just told you, realize this is the first time they've ever been independent in history. Independent. From 1990, 1991, I just gave you the whole spiel. It's the first time they've ever had their own independent, free country, ever. Okay? It's a fresh start. So the Ukrainian leaders, the intelligent ones, are like, let's not mar it. Let's not screw it up with anti-Semitism and all this other kind of stuff. Especially when the superpower in the West is America, the USA, which is totally opposed to anything connected with anti-Semitism. We don't want to get them angry, but I would say even without that, they have genuine liberals over there. Second of all, it immediately became clear, most of the Jews not going to be here, they're all going to Aliyah anyway. Is it true? So, third, once they saw Putin in 2000 afterwards, came to power and is acting friendly to the Jews, the Ukrainians realized if they're not friendly to the Jews and to the state of Israel, Putin will use this against them. Which, of course, as we all know, he said last week, he's invading the Ukraine to get rid of the Nazis. Okay? As he's indeed doing in the present war. But as he's done, since he's been in power in 2000, especially regarding the Holocaust narrative, where Putin never loses an opportunity to twist the knife. It's just very, very interesting. Okay? This is a whole speech by itself, but to give you the 2-minute version, as you know, and I've outlined here over the years, there are different peoples that suffered in different ways. Most of you have never heard what I've talked about tonight. But everybody's heard about Anne Frank and Auschwitz. So the Jews got their Holocaust narrative out there early, and it occupied central place and top place in post-World War II Western culture, even world culture, okay? The Jewish narrative. But the Poles have their narrative, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Estonians, the Ukrainians, the Belarus, everybody's got their own narrative out there. And as I pointed out in different lecture series, all the rest of it, a lot of these guys don't have such a great history in World War II. Especially the Lithuanians who shot all those Jews before the Germans showed up. The Ukrainians that I just showed you a couple of pictures of. So you can make the argument, and a Holocaust survivor will make this argument. The Ukrainians, Yamach Shemam. I was there and they were in the guards and they did worse than the Germans and stuff like that. Now I made the case, by the way, a number of years ago, and it does bear repeating, this is not true of the Poles. The Poles were not part of the Holocaust. They're not concentration camp guards. They didn't, the Polish was conquered by Hitler, didn't have any government, so that's not true. But it is true of the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, the Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians. You want to get down to that. And they killed plenty of the Jews and tortured, like the terrible pictures and stuff we saw before, big time. And even in Auschwitz, Dachau, a place like that, there were Ukrainian guards and Belarusian guards, and it was bad news. They sadistic and things like this. That doesn't mean that all Ukrainians are like this, because it's not true. They certainly were not all like, but they are represented over here. If I'm Putin, then I say like this: Soviet Union fought the Great War against Nazism. Well, you see, you see what I mean? It's complicated. They did. Not because Stalin was an American Democrat. And it's true that he teamed with Hitler and Hitler messed him up, but it's not false to say the Red Army broke Hitler, the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, the Red Army saved the Jew. You can put it that way. You see? And then you completely de-emphasize anything bad the Russians did. And again, I'll tell you again, if you talk to a concentration camp survivor, especially somebody who was in Auschwitz or Majdanek, one of these places, Russians were great. They stopped the killing of the Jews, the torturing of the Jews. It's a fact. I mean, Stalin was a rough guy. That's what they'll say. Okay, but he saved us. He saved it. You see how the narrative is complex, it's complicated? So if you're Putin, you'll say like this: we, the Russians, who lost 20, 30, 40 million people, which is true, we, the Russians, were the great enemies of fascism and Nazism. We're the ones who busted Hitler more than anybody else. We're the ones who fought the main battles against them. Therefore, we have the main share in the liberation of the Jewish people. And we should be very proud of what we did. Not like all these other peoples over there who were Nazistic, who joined with Hitler, who, as you see in Yad Vashem, participated gleefully in all these tortures, etc., etc., etc. Of course, he's doing that not because he's such a tzaddik and Ohev Yisrael. He's really clever against the Ukrainians, the Belarusians, and so forth. Now, Netanyahu Bibi has always played along with this. This is a major part of who Netanyahu, who's now out of power, has done, even though the narrative is complex. But Hitler, rightly, does honor the Red Army. And every minute when Bibi was in power, he was every 2 months in Moscow. And these ceremonies, which are a big deal in Russia, honoring the war dead and that kind of stuff. Here, look at this. This was not too long ago. It's in Moscow. That's Bibi. And that's Putin. That's the president of Serbia. Okay, that's enough. Now, it's not a Banana Cable Convention. It's a red square. Right? But on the other hand, I get it. Notice, people say like this, you got a bear out there, you have to be on the good side. And it's not false that the Red Army did beat Hitler. It's not false. You understand? So it doesn't mean that I'm totally subscribing to the Ukraine business, but when Putin, let me tell you something, Putin is the head of Serbia and the head of Israel. Why did he invite Bibi, and why is he like that? It gives validation to the Russian narrative, to the Soviet narrative. You see what I'm saying? So what a twisted world it's in. Now, he uses this as a tool against Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, against the Ukrainians and so forth. Putin cleverly and correctly includes the Jews as part of the narrative. So unlike others, he's not a Holocaust denier, and he's the head of Russia. Okay? It's a big deal. And he says, what was done to the 6 million Jews is terrible. Isn't it terrible what the Germans, the Ukrainians, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, and the others did? It's not exactly false. You understand? But you understand what I mean. So he can now say, so I'm invading Ukraine, get rid of the Nazis. Okay? Now, by the way, it is good for, at least until this week, we thought it's good for the Jews. This helps Medinat Israel, because the Jewish Holocaust narrative, as you know, is one of the major legitimation narratives of the state of Israel, that Israel is a tikkun for the Shoah. Now, you can disagree and say we have our own rights and all the rest of it, but out there in the world, especially in Eastern Europe, they say, yeah, there was a Holocaust and Israel got as a reward, Israel got a state. And here's the head of Russia saying it. Here, this is Bibi now in Yad Vashem. Okay? And they'll give
all what happened in Auschwitz, and it survived, and this is the most important document that we have, because this is, all the images are coming from this.
I think he's got them through. The shoes, you know, the shoes.
Там погибло около 250 тысяч человек, из них 100 тысяч евреев. Советских военнопленных потом перестали туда направлять.
Гитлер-Ходут. Когда мы в этом зале памяти зажигаем вечный огонь,
So look at it. You came and honored my war dead in Red Square, and I'm coming honoring your war dead in Yad Vashem. You can't fault that, right? On the other hand, you see the manipulation of the narrative. You get it? We live in interesting times. And so it's good for the Jews, I think, if a leader of the world goes to Yad Vashem and acknowledges the Jewish narrative. On the other hand, it does put Israel in bed with Putin's Russia, which at the present moment is not where Israel wishes to be. In my opinion, Putin has cleverly staked out a position vis-a-vis the Jews, which basically says like this: I'm nice to you, which he is, So don't interfere in my expansionist policy. If Russia takes over the Ukraine, we're not going to hurt the Jews. You'll be Lubavitch there and everything else, like they are in Russia. So why are you bothering me? What do you care? You understand? Now, in addition to that, Israel has to worry about Russia's crucial presence in Syria. As you know, they saved Assad's bacon. The whole Syria hates him. And he only survived because the Russians moved in heavy bombers and all this junk and bombed the heck out of the cities. I think we're reading about it and nobody paid attention when they did it at Aleppo and these other places a couple years ago because nobody paid attention. But now he's doing the Ukraine. I'm simply saying that as a result of this massive deployment of force on civilians, that's why Assad is now in power. Syria today is more dangerous to Israel than ever before. That's quite a statement I just made. I don't think most people realize that how really dangerous Syria is at the present time. First of all, you have the Iranian presence, as we all know, with the Hezbollah. We're talking about tens of thousands of missiles. Plus, I don't know if you follow the news, but Assad is currently in implementing a policy of demographic change. He's kicking all the Sunnis out, and he's importing Shiites from all over the place to repopulate the country. You know, it's the ultimate dictator thing. If you say, I'm unpopular with the people, let's switch the people. Yeah. Remember when Trump got elected, somebody said we have to switch the electorate, some Democrat, yeah? So you got to switch the people. Now, that means that he wants to move like 1 million Shiites adjacent to the Golan Heights. You get what I'm saying? They're playing hardball. That's one threat. Here comes another one. The Russian high-tech buildup in Syria. The Russian anti-aircraft missiles and technology could destroy the IAF if they go over Syria. The Russians got to do it. Look, I want to tell you something. That is what the USSR did to the Israeli Air Force in 1970 in the War of Attrition. We let them do it, but they did it. And so by 1971, 72, the Israeli Air Force couldn't fly over the Suez Canal, the thing, right? And we took it on the chin in the Yom Kippur War. I mean, this is what happened, okay? In this scary situation, Israel cannot simply cannot afford to tick off the bear. They can't do it, okay? We all know the famous Aesop's fables. It's in the Gemara also. You know, the stork that stuck his head in the lion's jaw to pull out the bone. And he said, where's my reward? Your reward is you stuck your head in the lion's jaw and then get killed. Israel is a small country. You're dealing with big boys over here. What is Israel going to take on the Russian army? Israel doesn't have to take on the Russian army. The Russians can simply turn up the heat in Syria and these other places, and it's really tough on Israel. Now, it's complicated. You see, I don't like when people... No, what I'm saying is like this. The Ukraine says, do the moral thing. I get that, and I do understand that. But Israel say like this. If we get attacked by all the Syrians, is Ukraine going to do the moral thing? You see, it's easy to be armchair moralist. It's not easy to actually sit in the chair. If I just glanced when I came home tonight, I think Bennett is in Moscow now. You understand? This is why. He doesn't want it, because he doesn't want the Russians to say this. Okay, we're turning up the anti-aircraft junk, and now Israel can't fly over here, and we'll let the Iranians come in and all the rest of it. America's not going to help them. Ukraine is not going to help them. Nobody's going to help them. You see? But Israel doesn't count. You see, it's like that. Oh, Rabbosai, what a tangled web we weave. What a tangled web the Jewish people face this week. What a tangled web. In conclusion, I can only understand Putin coming as a bitter reaction to 1991, which is why I entitled this lecture today, How Things Then Affect Us Now, the History of Ukraine. In the same way that 9/11 was a bitter reaction to 1922, even though it was 1922 when the British abolished the caliphate, when they got rid of the Ottoman Empire. What's that? You see? But they know, and they care, and he cared enough to blow up the buildings. So I can only conclude with the famous Chazal, which says, Rabbi Lezer Rabbani said, if you see great empires, in recent Malchus Mistagros, Elu Be'elu, when you see great kingdoms battling with each other, Tzapi l'raglo shel Mashiach, you may possibly expect the coming of the Mashiach, because in the time of Abraham, Bimei Avram Avinu, Adeshinizgar Malchus Elu Be'elu, Bal Guli Avram, when they had the word of 4 kings versus the 5 kings, in Parshat Lech Lecha, and by the time it was over, Abraham came out on top. So this is a way of saying, when you look at international events, especially violent international events, There are many angles from which to view it, and there are many angles from which to view it. The media has the angle that they want to push. The Russian media has the angle they want to push. I will merely conclude this series by saying we should look at the Jewish angle. And with that, I wish you good night, and we are adjourned, sine die.